There's a sound that old farmers know better than any weather app. It's the sound of rain that doesn't stop. Not a storm that blows through in 20 minutes and leaves the air smelling clean. The other kind. The kind that settles in over a ridge for 3 days straight, soaking into ground that's already full, until the hillside itself starts to remember it's not actually solid ground at all. It's just soil, sitting on a slope, waiting for a reason to move. This is a story about a 12-year-old boy, a stretch of hillside pasture nobody thought mattered, and 40 pounds of fieldstone at a time. It starts 3 summers before the rain that changed everything. The farm sat on 62 acres of rolling ground, the kind you find scattered across the Appalachian foothills and the upper Midwest alike. Pasture on the flats, a hayfield along the creek bottom, and a steep shoulder of hill behind the barn that had never been good for much of anything except growing thistle and eroding a little more every spring. Every farm has a piece of land like that. The part nobody quite knows what to do with. The boy's name doesn't matter as much as what he did, but for the sake of the story, let's say his name was Danny, and his grandfather ran the place. 3 generations deep, cattle and a few acres of corn. The kind of operation that's more common in America and the Netherlands than most city people realize. Small, mixed, worked hard, held on to out of stubbornness as much as love. Danny's grandfather used to say the hill behind the barn sheds topsoil like a dog sheds hair in July. Every heavy rain, a little more of the good dirt washed down into the drainage ditch and out toward the creek, taking nutrients, seed, and eventually the fence line with it. It wasn't dramatic. It was just slow, steady loss. The kind that doesn't show up until you've lost 20 years of it. Nobody paid it much attention until Danny started stacking rocks. It began almost by accident. Danny had been pulling fieldstone out of the corn ground every spring. That's a normal chore on a lot of American and Dutch farms alike, since glacial soil pushes stone to the surface every winter through a freeze-thaw cycle called frost heave. Water in the soil freezes, expands, and shoves rocks upward a fraction of an inch at a time. Over decades, that fraction of an inch adds up, and a field that was cleared of stone in your grandfather's day will have a fresh crop of them by the time you're grown. Most farms just haul that stone to a pile at the edge of the field and forget about it. Danny didn't forget about it. He started stacking it, not randomly, but the way he'd seen in an old photograph his grandfather kept, of a dry stone wall his great-great-grandfather had built back when the farm was first cleared. No mortar, no concrete, just stone laid on stone, each one chosen and turned until it sat right, wedged tight against its neighbors. It's called dry stone walling, and it's one of the oldest surviving building techniques in the world. You'll find it holding up hillsides in the Yorkshire Dales, along field boundaries in New England, and in old Dutch polder country where farmers once used fieldstone the same way before dikes and canals took over the job of managing water. The technique survived for thousands of years for one simple reason. It works with gravity and water instead of against them. A mortared wall is rigid. When the ground beneath it shifts even slightly, from frost, from water, from a slope settling, a solid wall cracks, and once it cracks, water gets into that crack, freezes, and destroys it from the inside. A dry stone wall has no such weakness. It's built with a batter, a slight inward lean on both faces, so the whole structure is wider at the base than the top, distributing weight downward and inward like a very shallow, very solid pyramid. Every stone touches at least 3 other stones. Larger through stones run the full width of the wall every few feet, tying the 2 faces together like a spine. And critically, this is the detail almost nobody outside the trade knows. A dry stone wall is full of small gaps. Deliberately, water passes straight through it, instead of pooling against it. That single detail is the whole story. Danny didn't build his wall along the fence line, though. He built it across the hill. At first, it looked like exactly what everyone said it was. A kid playing in the dirt. Danny's uncle, who helped out at haying time, called it monkeying around instead of doing chores. A neighbor joked that the boy was building himself a fort. Even Danny's grandfather, who'd taught him what little he knew about the old wall, admitted he didn't see the point of putting the effort into a pasture slope that didn't grow anything worth protecting. But Danny kept going. Every free hour after chores, every Saturday, he was up on that hillside with a wheelbarrow and a chisel-tipped hammer, working stone by stone across the slope. not up and down it, but along the contour, following the natural level line around the hill the way water does when it's looking for the lowest path. This is where the story stops being about a stubborn kid and starts being about real agricultural science. Because what Danny was building, probably without knowing the technical term for it, was a contour terrace. Terracing is one of the oldest soil conservation techniques in agriculture, going back thousands of years to hillside rice farming in Asia and vineyard slopes in the Mediterranean. The principle is simple. Water running downhill gains speed, and speed is what causes erosion. Fast-moving water picks up soil particles and carries them away. A terrace, a flat or gently sloped step built across the hillside, interrupts that flow. It forces the water to slow down, spread out, and either soak into the ground or drain off gradually instead of all at once. A stone wall built along a contour line does the same job as a terrace, but it does something a simple earthen terrace can't. It holds firm, even when the soil behind it is fully saturated. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story, because saturated soil is exactly what causes a mudslide. Here's the biology and geology of it, because this isn't a story about luck, it's a story about physics. Soil holds together because of a property called shear strength. Essentially, the internal friction and cohesion between soil particles that lets a slope hold its shape instead of flowing like a liquid. Roots reinforce that shear strength directly. Grass roots typically only reach a few inches to a foot deep. Deep-rooted plants, trees, shrubs, certain perennial grasses, send roots several feet down, and those roots act almost like rebar in concrete, binding soil particles together and letting the roots themselves absorb some of the mechanical stress that would otherwise pull the slope apart. There's also a network most people never think about: mycorrhizal fungi, a symbiotic fungus that colonizes plant roots and extends thread-like structures called hyphae through the soil, sometimes for many feet beyond the root itself. These fungal networks glue soil particles together with a sticky protein called glomalin, and they dramatically improve how well soil holds its structure and drains water. A hillside with a healthy fungal network and deep-rooted vegetation behaves completely differently in a heavy rain than a hillside that's been overgrazed, compacted, or stripped down to shallow-rooted grass. Now add water. Soil has pore space, tiny gaps between particles that normally hold air, or a manageable amount of moisture. When rain falls faster than the soil can absorb and drain it, those pore spaces fill completely with water. At that point, the soil is described as saturated, and something important happens. The water itself starts carrying part of the weight that used to be supported by friction between soil grains. Pore water pressure rises, effectively pushing the soil particles apart and reducing the internal friction holding the slope together. Once shear strength drops below the pull of gravity on that slope, the hillside fails. That's a landslide, or on a smaller, faster, wetter scale, a mudslide. It's not a slow slump. Saturated soil can let go all at once, and on a steep enough slope with enough accumulated water, it can move at startling speed, carrying trees, fences, topsoil, and anything else in its path. This is exactly why terracing and contour barriers matter so much in real-world hillside farming and construction. From the rice terraces of the Philippines, to hillside vineyards in California, to soil conservation work throughout the American Midwest following the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, when the U.S. Soil Conservation Service was formed specifically because uncontrolled water runoff and wind erosion had devastated millions of acres of farmland. Contour farming, terracing, and windbreak plantings became standard practice because they physically slow water down before it can gain the speed and volume needed to strip a hillside bare. There's a second factor that matters just as much as slope and saturation: soil texture. Clay-heavy soils hold water longer and swell as they absorb it, which can actually increase pressure on a slope over time. Sandy soils drain fast but hold together poorly once wet, offering little resistance once saturation sets in. Loam, a balanced mix of sand, silt, and clay, drains reasonably well while still holding structure, which is part of why healthy pasture loam, reinforced with deep roots and fungal networks, tends to be far more stable in a heavy rain than compacted or overgrazed ground of the same slope and soil type. A hillside's fate in a 3-day rain isn't decided by the storm alone. It's decided by years of decisions about what grows on that hillside, how deep its roots run, and what, if anything, stands in the water's way on the way down. Danny didn't know the term poor water pressure, but he'd watched enough hard rains wash a little more of that hillside into the ditch to understand, in a plain, practical way, that water needed somewhere to go besides straight down the slope in a hurry. So he gave it somewhere to go. By the second summer, Danny's wall wasn't just one line across the hill. It had become three, stepped one above the other, each one following the contour a little further up the slope, each one built with a slight downhill batter and small internal drainage gaps at the base so water could weep through slowly instead of pressing against a solid face. Between the walls, the ground leveled out just enough to slow runoff to a crawl. And on Danny's own initiative, something his grandfather later admitted surprised him more than the walls themselves. The boy had started seeding the flattened strips between each wall with a mix of deep-rooted native grasses and clover, the same kind of forage cover recommended in soil conservation programs for exactly this purpose. Fast establishment, deep root systems, and nitrogen-fixing benefits from the clover that improved soil health at the same time it was holding that soil in place. It took 3 summers. Sunburn, blistered hands, more sore muscles than a boy that age usually earns. The neighbors who joked about the fort mostly stopped joking, not because they were convinced it mattered, but because 3 years is a long time to keep making fun of something. His grandfather still didn't fully understand what the boy was building toward. He just knew that hillside looked different than it used to. Steadier somehow. Less like a slope waiting to slide, and more like a staircase the land had decided to grow. Nobody could have told you, looking at it, that it was about to save the farm. It came in early spring of the boy's 15th year, 3 days of rain on top of a slow snowmelt, the ground already saturated before the first drop even fell. The kind of weather system that meteorologists now increasingly link to more intense, concentrated rainfall events across both the American Midwest and parts of Northern Europe, including the Netherlands, where water management has been a matter of national survival for centuries, and where the historic response to exactly this kind of threat has always been to slow water down and give it a controlled place to go, rather than simply trying to hold it back all at once. By the second night, the creek was over its banks. By the third morning, word came down the valley that a hillside 2 farms over, steep pasture, overgrazed for years, no ground cover to speak of, had given way. A section of slope the size of a football field had simply let go all at once, carrying trees and fence posts and half a season's topsoil down into the neighbor's bottomland, burying a stretch of hayfield under several feet of mud and debris. It happened at 4 in the morning. Nobody was hurt, but it took out a barn's worth of stored hay, a quarter-mile of good fence, and a season's worth of soil that had taken decades to build. That same storm hit Danny's farm just as hard. The hillside behind the barn took on more water in those 3 days than it had in the previous 5 years combined, and it held. The 3-stepped walls did exactly what they were built to do. Water hit the first wall, slowed, pooled just enough on the flattened terrace behind it to soak in rather than race downhill, and what didn't soak in trickled through the deliberate gaps at the base of the wall in a controlled sheet instead of a torrent. What made it past the first terrace hit the second wall and slowed again. By the time any runoff reached the base of the hill near the barn, it was a manageable trickle instead of the wall of mud and debris that hit the farm 2 properties over. The grass and clover roots between the walls held the soil together even as it sat fully saturated for days. Nothing moved. Nothing gave way. Danny's grandfather walked the hillside the morning after the rain stopped, boots sinking into soft ground everywhere except along the walls themselves, and stood for a long time looking at what his grandson had built. Word travels fast in farm country, and it travels just as fast whether you're in rural Ohio or a small agricultural town in Overijssel. Within a week, half the township had heard that the boy who'd spent 3 summers wasting time stacking rocks on a worthless hillside had built the only piece of high ground on that stretch of the valley that hadn't moved an inch. County extension agents came out to look. So did a couple of old-timers who remembered when dry stone walls were standard practice on hill farms before machinery and cheap wire fencing made them seem like a relic of a slower age. What they found wasn't luck. It was sound, old engineering. The same fundamental principles used in modern erosion control structures, just executed with fieldstone and patience instead of concrete and heavy equipment. There's a lesson in that which goes beyond one hillside. The oldest solutions in farming, dry stone walls, contour terracing, deep-rooted cover crops, letting water move slowly instead of trying to stop it outright, were developed over centuries precisely because they work with the land's own physics instead of fighting it. Modern agriculture sometimes forgets those lessons in favor of speed and convenience. And modern weather, wetter and more concentrated than it used to be in a lot of places, has a way of reminding people why those old techniques earned their keep in the first place. Danny didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. He just didn't like watching good dirt wash away, and he was stubborn enough and patient enough to do something about it one stone at a time, for 3 summers, with nobody telling him it mattered. That's really the whole story. Not a boy who got lucky. A boy who understood, in his own plain way, something that farmers and dike builders and hillside terrace farmers have understood for thousands of years. The land doesn't reward the fastest fix. It rewards the one who's willing to build something slow and solid and built to last, long before the day it's actually needed. The hillside behind that barn still stands today, 3-stepped walls of fieldstone, grass, and clover growing thick and deep-rooted between them, doing exactly the quiet, patient work they were built for, waiting, the way good stonework always does, for the next hard rain.